Welcome back. We are on our fifth video in our last video. This video is going to go over the export settings, and then we're going to import it into iZotope's Ozone 7 Advanced, where we will do our mixing, or our mastering, excuse me, and we'll do an export from Ozone as an MP3 and our WAV file, and we will bring it into Audacity and check for clipping, intersample clips, and we will go from there. And if we have any clipping, I will go over how to fix it, and etc. etc. So when we export our mix from Logic or whichever DAW you are using, make sure that all of your tracks are selected, your reference track is muted, double check everything that your levels are good, all that stuff. I just checked them and everything is clean and ready to rock and roll. I've applied, as I mentioned in the first video before we actually started this series, I applied fades to the beginning and end of each clip to avoid clipping and not clipping, popping, in case the audio file did not bounce correctly. So now that I have the entire track selected, we're going to go to File. Make sure you save your project. It doesn't hurt to save. And then we're going to go to Bounce, Project or Section. This is, of course, in Logic. For mastering, I generally like to do a 24-bit 48 kilohertz file. Interleaved means that you have the left and right channels are put together. If you do split, then that means you'd have to mix the left channel and the right channel separately. Not recommended. Just one file. And we don't want any dithering. And I'll explain what dithering is later on once we master. 24-bit 48 is generally the standard. However, some like 16-bit 44.1, 16-bit 48, 24-bit 41. It's really up to the engineer or who's mixing or mastering your track. Just ask them what they prefer. However, I usually like to export at 24-bit 48 kilohertz. Side note, if this is a live session, say you recorded at 16-bit 48, then you would want to export at 16-bit 48. If you recorded your stuff at 24-bit 48K, like I have set here, then export it at 24-bit 48K. That's going to give you the best resolution, the highest resolution, highest quality, and it's going to avoid any calculation errors when your computer is exporting and trying to upsample or downsample or all that stuff. So we make sure that your normalizing is off. Normalizing is going to bring up your level to hit 0. So the highest peak in your song is going to be normalized to 0. We do not want that. We want our levels to sit right at -6 dB where we have them right now. So leave normalizing off, and we're going to export this. We are going to bounce this to our bounces. We'll do tutorial change mix. That's fine. And we'll bounce it. If you want, you can do this is an offline bounce, so it just zips through it like this. If you want, you could do an online bounce, which would mean the song would play back and it would export as it's playing. If you have a large session and say, or a slower computer, that would be recommended because make sure that all your automation is captured, your plugins are captured, every little detail is captured. And if I had a larger session, I would certainly do that. And if I was doing it for a higher end client, I would certainly do an online bounce, just to make sure that I capture everything. Here we have our song that we've just done. So this is really up to how the chain that you want, the chain that you want to use. I generally like to do this. I like to put an imager on first and get everything stereoized, spread, set into mono, etc., etc. Then I like to put in a compressor Right? No, I like to EQ. That's right. I like to EQ a little bit. And then I like to put in my compressor, which is going to be, I can't remember if I like to do, I think, let's try the vintage compressor here. I don't know if multi-band compression is going to sound. I think I tried it one time and I didn't really like the way it was coming out. However, we might try it. And then what I like to do is I like to do the vintage limiter, and then I like to do the maximizer. And I like to do the maximizer and the vintage limiter are essentially the same thing. However, I like to have the limiter do a little bit of the work and then the maximizer do more of the work, because you don't want to put the entire strain to get the volume up to one limiter, because it's overworking and it's not going to work as well. It genuinely doesn't sound as good. So that's why I like to do 2 limiters. So I like to bypass everything so we don't have anything being set. And then I like to find our loudest peak of the track, which is this section. And then I like to solo everything and see where everything's sitting. Okay, and then we have our, it's pretty close into mono here, but we want to make sure it's in mono. And we're just going to drive it right into mono there. Actually, we could even go up to 135. Okay, and then we'll move on to the next band. I'd like to bring this down a little bit. Cool. I can spread this just a little bit. Same with, even though it's pretty wide to begin with, spread it just a little bit. See how that sounds? We'll bypass it. Again, just like our mixing, subtlety is key. Keeping things subtle is very important. So now we'll move on to our EQ. Again, I kind of like to brush through this quickly. Not real quickly, but take my time. And then come back to it. Tweak it as everything's finished. Come back and tweak. Like, oh, the EQ sounds a little bit off now that I'm limiting. So I'll come back and I'll tweak the EQ. Because after all, this is the final product. This is what's going to go on YouTube. This is what's going to go on iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, etc., etc., etc. So now we'll engage our EQ. I like to use the digital one. The analog one sounds cool too. Let's try analog. And I like to do mid-side processing for this. Band 1, we don't need in the, actually, low shelf, in the side, we're going to high pass that because we don't need anything. This is our sides. We don't need any low end in the sides. So I think that sounds good where it's at. Our low end, this is essentially mono. We could even cut that and move it to 20 hertz and cut some of that off. Because again, 20 hertz, we don't need anything below that. We can boost, I like to boost some of the side frequencies. Boost them up a little bit. I like that. Yeah, rock on. Cool. Yep. Okay, so now we're going to use the vintage compressor. I really like the sound of this, and I think smooth is going to be, because it's kind of a smooth track. I like it. The auto gain on this is, I really like it. It sounds really good. So we'll play with it. Sometimes I turn it off, sometimes I leave it on. It really depends on, again, how it sounds. So this is the detection filter. It's not going to detect anything below this. It's not going to affect the compressor. So if we want the compressor to kick in with stuff above 100 hertz, then we're going to move it down. But 200 hertz generally works because this is very low end heavy and I don't really want that hitting the compressor because then we're going to not get as much compression as I'd like. So right now we can bring up the attack, bring the release down a bit. Again, you can really slam this compressor and we're getting 7 dB. The only thing that really affecting is the kick, and even the kick still has some punch to it. I don't like to go over 1.5 dB of compression generally. I think the auto gain sounds great. I don't really notice anything different when it's off and when it's on, so I think we'll leave it. Cool. Yeah, I like how that sounds. Now we'll do the vintage. We'll do true peak. We'll do a slower character, and let's leave it on analog. Let's try analog, and I like to bring this down to -0.01. -0.01. Okay. Okay. -0.1, I should say. My bad. So let's try these different settings. We'll try tube modern and then the analog one. I like the analog. It's still got some punch. It's got some little bit of harmonic distortion. True peak limiting is on, and I like the character. Everything sounds great, so we're going to leave it at that. So now we'll go on to my favorite part, is the maximizer. So we're going to enable true peak. I'm going to bring this down to 0.1. I think, let's see, transient emphasis. I like to bring that up because I like it to emphasize the transients a little bit. Not that this one has a lot of them, but it does. I really like the fourth one. Modern transient. Let's do that. And so yeah, let's do transparent, bring it up smooth. Fair warning, just check your, make sure that your headphones or earbuds or whatever, because it will get loud. Cool. I really like how that sounds. I think it sounds pretty good. Yeah. If, as you can see here, we're looking at our inputs and our output monitors. So this is our peak, and this is our RMS. RMS is root mean squared, which is the average, which is more how we perceive the loudness. So let's listen to it, and we'll watch this meter here. So we're hitting right around -6 RMS, which is pretty loud. It's pretty crazy loud. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because that's usually what consumers want these days, is it has to be loud. They don't care about dynamic range, especially for electronic music, hip-hop music. They just want it hitting. So we can bypass it, and we'll go from before and after. Again, watch your ears, because it does jump from quiet to loud. So it's bypassed now. Good. I think it sounds pretty good. So we'll save it. Let's listen to it in mono. Make sure, because most PA systems, if this were to be played on a big PA system, it would be in mono, not stereo. If I remember correctly, it sounds good in mono. However, we're getting a little bit of aliasing. Everything else sounds good, but we did throw that stereo spreader on there, which is affecting it ever so slightly. If we can remember correctly, the samples were very, very wide to begin with. And if I do remember correctly, I did throw it in and check it in mono before when I first mixed it and mastered it, and it did the same thing. So, I mean, there's really nothing I could do about it. It was a problem with the sample, being that it was so loud, or so wide. So we're kind of getting some phasing and aliasing and stuff. So really, there's nothing you can do about it. We've got it as best as we can in mono. Now what I'll do is I'll export the audio files. We're going to export the wave first. Make sure that it's set to correct. Yes, that's where I want it to go. So we want 44.1 16-bit, and we want to enable dithering. What dithering is when you're going from a higher bit depth, so 24-bit, we export it as 24-bit, and we're going to 16-bit now. What dithering does is it takes the higher frequencies, the information that's lost, and it kind of puts random noise. It's like very subtle white noise to kind of counteract the bit loss and the quality lost when you're degrading the bit depth. So when you go from a higher bit depth to a lower bit depth, 24 to 16 in this case, you want to enable dithering. Now there's different modes of dithering, and each one does something different. I'm not too keen on all that information. You want to make sure dithering is enabled when you're going from a higher bit depth to a lower bit depth. Sample rate, we're going from 48 to 44.1, which is fine. Shouldn't lose any quality. Shouldn't lose a whole lot of quality there. Just make sure that your enabled dithering is on. and we're going to do a WAV file and export. So now we're going to export an MP3. I like to export MP3s because if the client wants to hear it, I like to export the MP3 just because they're smaller, they're not as big, they're easier to, more web friendly, etc., etc. So I usually do 320 kilobits per second MP3, and we'll change this to master MST, and then we'll export it. We don't need to enable dithering here. We're going to export, and we can go title. We'll do change. Do track. We can do year. MP3s consist of metadata. You can use metadata, and this is a hip hop track. So we'll do export. So now we'll open up Audacity, and we will go ahead and import our tracks. I love Audacity. I use it to check content, my mixes all the time. So let's do the WAV file first. And we don't have any clipping. It says show clipping. We don't have any red lines. That's good. MP3, yeah. See these red lines here? That is clipping. Intersample clips, which we certainly don't want. We'll go down, and we go into the maximizer, and we bring, I like to bring MP3s down even, we'll try half a dB. Actually, let's just go 1 dB to be safe. So now we'll go in and we'll re-export the audio files. We'll export it to the same place. Yes, I want to replace it. So you certainly don't want any clipping, especially if it's going to go on to iTunes, all this stuff. You want it to be as professional as possible. The reason why you don't want to just export it from Audacity after you've, say, you reduce the volume is because the sample has already clipped. You've already chopped up that information on the file, and just bringing it down, it's still gonna clip. It's still clipped. It's still distorted. So all you're doing is you're just bringing it down, so it's not distorting as loudly. It's still gonna distort. So you just need to go in and re-export it. It's not that big of a deal to go in and re-export the MP3, especially with Ozone. It does it incredibly fast. Well, not incredibly, as you can see here, but it does it fairly fast, and it does a really good job of it. So now what we'll do is we'll go in and we'll import audio, and we'll do MP3, open, boom. Now we see no red lines. Perfect. And if you want, you can go in and say bump it up to half a dB and see if it clips. If it doesn't clip, perfect. However, this works for me because if you were to upload this to, say, if you're going to release it on iTunes and stuff, iTunes is going to go ahead and knock it down a dB or 2 dB anyways to prevent so it doesn't clip. And again, we can go in and listen to it. Sounds good to me. We have a good RMS. Our transients is good. We have a decent dynamic range. It's fairly loud. I would not be hesitant to send this off to the client. So, that being said, I appreciate you sticking with me during this process of mixing, mastering, balancing everything, a hip-hop track. I really enjoy doing this for you guys. So if you have any tracks that you would like me to mix and master, please feel free to send them over to me. And if you would like me to do a tutorial on it so I can share the knowledge with the world, I would certainly love to do that as well. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this. I look forward to teaching you guys in the future.